this session is actually going to cover those areas, and these are very, very important for, you know, not-for-profit organizations, because we are confronted with a lot of challenges today, as you might be experiencing. Gone are the days when everything was easy, there was no control, but then the situation for not-for-profits has changed significantly in the last about 5 years. So we will begin with that, and this is how the layout of the session is. The rationale for risk management in terms of understanding the very basis or the reason for risk management. As I said, for profit people, they talk of risk management before they take any decision. And that increasingly is becoming the case even for not-for-profits. Then we will see the key concepts of risk relating to risk and controls. The third one is the risk management policy. So donors increasingly are now talking about risk management policy as a separate policy for managing risks to the organization. Now, donors are putting in money, and therefore they are very concerned about, the kind of uh, risk that that organization is facing and what action that organization is taking to manage the risk. Therefore, the risk management policy and the risk management process is very, very important. So you must have seen when we were doing policies, key policies, we had mentioned about risk management policies. And I have been mentioning about internal controls right from the beginning, from our first session where we said why finance is to be known by non-finance, because we have to, abide by internal controls. And we have seen several areas of internal controls. We have seen compliance controls, we have seen financial policies, we have seen HR policy, and so we are also going to see the risk management policy. Now, then we will see the concept of internal control. And please remember, internal control is like an antibiotic for a risk. Okay. So if there is a risk, then controls is like the antibiotic. And I always give that example. So if you have fever as a person, then probably you are running a risk. Okay. And that risk can be controlled by an antibiotic or by a course of medication. Now, the course of medication for an organization in case of a situation of risk is controls. And that is how we have to understand. So the risk and controls are two sides of the same coin, the organization being the coin and the risks and controls being two sides of the coin. So both of them have to be, available. Then we will see what are the areas of internal controls for a not-for-profit. This will be some kind of a revision in terms of what we have done, somewhat of a revision, but then we will see what are the areas in which internal controls need to be put in place by an organization. It's not necessary that they can put all internal controls at one go, but as the organization evolves, as it grows, as it develops, more and more internal controls can be put in depending upon the need for internal controls when facing a risk situation. And then last but not the least, we will do the concept of efficiency and effectiveness. I would again draw attention to the fact that in the first session we had said while the primary objective of a not-for-profit organization is impact or maximization of social good, the secondary objectives of a not-for-profit are economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. And the concept of efficiency and effectiveness is something which is very, very important for organizations today. So that is something that we are going to study. Now, I want to say this again and again that risk management is becoming a very critical factor for not-for-profit organizations. And therefore, uh, good organizations are looking at ways to identify, analyze, assess, and address risk. That's the that's the basic reason why we are doing this. And the amount of risks that an organization is exposed to, just like an individual, are actually increasing by the day. Can, as an individual, can we address all risks? Possibly no. But can we identify and analyze those risks which have the greatest potential to damage, to cause damage to us? Probably yes. Can we put up a plan for that? Probably yes. So similarly, for an individual, we have the organization also into a risk situation. So let's begin the session today. Now, why understand risk management? And this is very important for us to, first, have an idea of what risk management as a subject is. Now, uh, as I said, risk is a must discussion. I've been dealing with donors, I've been dealing with not-for-profits. Now, the NGO funder relationship now is beginning with an understanding of risk by the funder. Okay. Uh, so the idea is how to understand that risk, how to capture that risk, and how to mitigate the risk for the not-for-profit. So when we have been talking about grant management and we are talking about due diligence, at that stage, the donor wants to understand from the not-for-profit what is the risk profile of this organization. Okay. And the risk profile will give an understanding whether this organization is the right fit in terms of risk for us to fund. That's the first thing that we need to understand. And therefore, in most donor audits these days, the donors are saying, well, we want to find out whether there is a risk management policy in place, or is the risk management process being followed within the policy. So it's not just a policy, but the policy will provide for the procedure. We had seen the difference between policy and procedure, and that procedure has to be followed and repeated. Like just like in the finance policy, you have procedures, you keep repeating it. Okay. The other thing is good risk management, if you are identifying and managing risk, is basic to the effective uh, to an effective organization. So we will see what is effective, and I think all of you would remember there is a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. Effectiveness is the net outcome. Okay. How well we have achieved the outcome of social good. Okay. Maximizing social good. And the second thing, it ensures better delivery of services. So one, it says you have delivered well, but also it creates that brand equity among the community. Now we have to understand two concepts relating to risk, and these are the ones at the center. One is what is called as risk appetite, and second is what is called as risk tolerance. It's very important to understand these concepts. It's similar to drawing a parallel for you as an individual. So if you were driving, now, your risk appetite says, I will not drive more than 60. Okay. I will not drive more than 60. That is your risk appetite because of your profile. Because your profile is like that. Some individuals might say, well, I will drive at 80. And the other might say, because of the difference in the risk profile, the risk appetite is the willingness to take risk, you know, and we are driving to reach a certain destination. Similarly, an organization has to decide what is the risk appetite based on its profile. Now, you might see some organizations being more aggressive, other organizations being conservative, and therefore their aggression or conservativeness will decide the risk appetite, how much risk they are willing to take. Now, they might not be willing to take more risks, and therefore, they might lose some opportunity. But that's all right because of the difference in the risk profile, the risk willingness will be defined. And the second concept is risk tolerance. Now, risk willingness is a very subjective thing. I am risk averse, I am moderate risk taker, I am aggressive risk taker, I am medium risk taker, all that. Now, that will define what is your risk appetite. But you will never, when you work in an organization or when you are an individual, will you always be driving at 60? No, you will have to at times drive at a higher speed. Okay, because the traffic conditions are comfortable and you can drive. So the risk tolerance in your case means what is the maximum amount, maximum kilometer or the maximum speed beyond which I will not go in any situation. That is the risk tolerance. Okay. So I will say I'll go to 80, but not more than 80 from 60, given situations being favorable. That is what is called risk tolerance. Okay. Risk tolerance is the ability. or the boundary to take acceptable deviation from your risk appetite. Now, your risk appetite was 60, but you are saying that I can deviate from the risk appetite, but my tolerance for risk or the ceiling for risk is 80. Similarly, when organizations work, they cannot just say, my risk appetite stops at here. It will depend on the situation in which the organization is, and therefore, the tolerance will have to be decided by the organization. Okay. Now, the tolerance for an organization is different from an individual, but I'm trying to draw a parallel to show you what is the difference between risk appetite and risk tolerance. Okay. So, uh, that the difference between the two, you know, the what is risk management, therefore? The risk management is what risk management is uh, basically uh, or as I say, how to bridge the gap between risk appetite and risk tolerance. So you have a risk appetite which will ensure that you are able to very comfortably take risk, okay, manage the risk. But you will have risk tolerance where you will be taking risk. Now, the risk management is nothing but how do you bridge the gap between what you were in terms of risk appetite and what you might need to do in terms of your risk tolerance. Now, the risk tolerance means that the risk management process has come to a stage where beyond that tolerance, if you were to take an action, it will cause a lot of harm to your organization, similar to what your individual are. But we don't write a risk management policy for ourselves because we do it on an individual by individual basis. Okay, and that is because we have a mind of our own. The organization doesn't have a mind of its own. We are the mind of the organization. So we will have to put in place a risk management process so that we can say that our tolerance to risk and the appetite to risk in during this gap that is there, or during the distance that we have to cover up to risk tolerance, because we have to deliver to the objectives, is what we need to manage, and that is what is called as risk management. Okay. Now, for instance, you might say, well, I will operate my programmatic thing is I will do five my staff, my coordinator or my foot soldier or my interpersonal communicator will do five households in a day in terms of house to house reach. But will you then say that beyond five, if for some reason we will allow that to happen at seven? Okay, that's your risk tolerance. One, because it will beyond that, you are running a risk with that person, jeopardizing his or her health and also her safety, his or her safety. And beyond that, the effectiveness or efficiency with which you have to deliver will also get affected. Now, while the five is your risk appetite, your seven is your risk tolerance. And for everything, whether it's procurement, whether it's programming, whether it's finance, there has to be some amount of risk tolerance that we will have to take, because it cannot be static risk willingness appetite. Risk appetite might be our understanding of risk, but when we actually work in normal situations, as we work as individuals, we never face the same situation. So the situations might change, which might actually prompt us to take some risk beyond our appetite. And that boundary of that risk that we can take is what is called as risk tolerance. Now, to manage the gap between, or to manage the distance between risk appetite and risk tolerance, is risk management. Now, if you can understand this concept, very clearly, you will be able to understand risk management and the rest of the session. Now, besides the risk, you have to also understand the concept of internal controls. So we will see internal controls. Now, this is why we need to understand risk management, so that we do not get into uncharted territory and cause great harm to our organization. Now, why risk management for a not-for-profit? So, understanding the the rationale or the reason for risk management is that in action, we have to take risk in an organization. Why risk management is important? So I've put down some points here. One is financial stability, meaning that if you have an understanding of risk or you have a risk management process or system, then the financial resources of our organization will be used and will be used properly, and we will be stable. For us, financial stability is very important because that is our lifeblood. Just as you have blood in your body, the finance in an organization is the blood in that organization. So we need to ensure that there is financial stability. How will you have financial stability? When there are rules and regulations. Financial stability will come when there are financial policies and procedures. Or what are we had talked about organizational policies. We had said, what are organizational policies? They are all tools for internal control. And why tools for internal controls? Because we need to manage the risk. The bridge bit the gap, risk appetite and tolerance is what will be managed by that finance policy. Operational efficiency basically means your area, which means that if you have a risk management understanding, then you will also say, as I gave you an example, if for some reason you couldn't do 5 households, can you do 7? That's what the risk management will help you to understand, because of some reason that you were not able to do it. Third is compliance management, which is basically statutory regulatory compliances. Now, if you understand compliance risk, then you will have a mechanism for managing it. Otherwise, compliance risk, if you don't manage, then that can cause the loss to your organization's existence, because you might lose your registrations, you might lose your 12A registration, and you might just become a for-profit entity. Now, if you become a for-profit entity because of the compliance lapse and therefore regulatory decision to withdraw or cancel your registration, that's a very major risk for you. So compliance management is ensured through proper risk management. Disciplined planning, and I told you finance has the responsibility for planning as also program. So have a risk management process, you have understanding of risk and internal controls. Planning and decision making both will be not only disciplined, but the decision making will be informed, it will be more strategic, because the decision making will be based on following certain rules and regulations, certain data, certain information points that will help manage the risk. These are all ways to manage risk. Then the reputation management. This is very important for bigger organization. If they do not have proper risk management systems, then the reputation can get tarnished because of some kind of wrongdoing, some kind of breach of trust. So that can create a lot of reputation issues. Smaller organization might not realize it, but medium and bigger organization have lot of they do a lot of work to ensure that proper risk management is there so that their image and reputation is not tarnished. Building trust in the community, among donors, among other stakeholders, is what risk management does. Improved communication, because you have rules and regulations and you'll have to follow them. So you will consistently communicate what the decisions are, what your actions are, what your reporting is. Long-term impact and sustainability. That's the final outcome of any organization. So whatever we do, will it bring about long-term impact? Because you have rules and regulations, you have understanding of risk, you have risk management systems. So your impact will be better, and your own existence or sustainability, as we call it, over a longer period of time will be ensured. So these are some of the points. I've mentioned them as points, but you must need to understand what each point means to your organization as it grows. Now, and as the organization grows, the risk appetite will change, the risk tolerance will change, the kind of risk that will affect you, they will all change. So from there, we move on to the key concepts of risk. Okay. Uh, Now, what is there has to be a difference between risk and threat. Okay. Threat is more universal. So, uh, a threat is a danger in the environment. So it's all available. When we move out of our house, or even if we are in our house, there is some threat, because in the environment there is a threat. Okay, so uh, threat means in Hindi it's called khatara. Basically, it means that there is some amount of danger in the very environment in which we are as individuals or as organization. Okay, something which can cause harm, a potential for causing harm, legislative changes, technology, competition, so many, inflation, okay, globalization, they are all changes that are happening in the environment, and they can be a threat. They can cause damage to you. But all threat is not risk. Okay, all threat that is there, threat will be universal. But is all threat applicable to an organization or individual? No. Some of the threats, because of the need to take action, will be the risk that we will need to understand. So, what is the risk? The risk is two things: probability. Probability means likelihood, chance of, and potential impact. That is the adverse impact that a particular threat, because we have to consider that threat for our action. So will all threats be relevant to our actions in an organization or an individual? No. Those threats which we have to encounter because we have to work in the organization, and those threats which have the probability. So two things have to be understood: the chance or the likelihood or probability is one very important factor. Is it likely to take place, and what is the impact on achievement of our objectives while encountering that threat? So the threat will become only that threat will become a risk where we have to work in a particular for achievement of our objective. And that threat, if it has the potential for harm and is likely to have occur, is what is called as risk. Okay, so that is something that you have to understand. So from the threat brings the risk, because we have to take certain decisions, we have to do certain actions. Now that threat, when it has when it has two characteristics: one, the probability of occurring, and the potential impact that it might have on our organization, that's risk. Now risk can be internal, risk can be external. Now, internal risk means risk from within the organizations, and they are more controllable because they are happening within the organization. HR risk, maybe technology risk, maybe some kind of a financial irregularity risk. All that is something which is from within the organization. So we have risk from within the organization also, and we have external risks which are from outside the organization. Means they are uncontrollable: political risk, legal risk, compliance risk, statutory risk. Okay, those are all risks which are in the external environment. They are not there. They are not in our control. But we will still have to manage those risks. The ability of an organization to manage internal risk is more compared to external risk, because internal risks are internal to the organization. Now, despite the fact that we take every action to reduce the risk, there will still be some amount of risk. Okay, that's what is called as residual risk. That is what is called as residual risk. So even if you take the best of actions, some risk will still be there. You cannot make the risk zero. That is what I'm trying to say. Okay, uh, you know, the environment will still have some risk. You can only reduce the risk. And what will be what will be the effect of reduction of that risk? The reduction of the action to reduce the risk in taking an action will ensure that the probability of that risk will reduce, and the impact of that risk will also come down. Now that is exactly what we want, because we don't want our organization to get affected in terms of the probability and more importantly the potential impact. Okay, so this is the basic concept of risk from the point of view of our discussion, in terms of when we started with our discussion in terms of why the rationale for risk management and why risk management in an organization. So we are now moving to understand the concept of risk, understanding that risk management is essential. Okay. And we have come to a point where we are saying risk is something that we will have to encounter when we take a decision. And that has the chance of occurring. And that has, because of the chance of occurring, it also has the chance of causing harm, but we can manage that risk. Okay. Do we always need resources for managing that risk, additional resources? No. It might be only an understanding of the risk and a way to deal with that risk with the existing resources. Sometimes you may need additional resources, but not always. So a lot of times when we are, so this entire topic today does not mean that we have to put in 1 lakh rupees or 2 lakh rupees extra in our organization for implementing this. Probably you don't need anything. You only need an understanding of this area so that you can bring the concept of risk management in your organization slowly, slowly. Okay. So that's what you said. And we said some risk will be there, doesn't matter, but that will cause very little harm. Now, the kind of risks that not for profit organizations face. So, what are the types of risks that are there? One is ethical risk, you know, uh, unethical behavior, something which is uh, not the right kind of behavior. Now, this ethical behavior can be external, internal, but it mostly will be internal. The next one is what is called as operational risk. Okay. Now we had seen if we have risk, if we have risk management, then operational risk will also come down. Okay. And operational efficiency will be there. We will be able to achieve our objectives better. That is what is operational risk. Our goals, our project deliverables, that will be that is what is called as operational risk. Our ability to achieve our goals. Now, in terms of final goal, what is the final goal? Maximizing social impact. And how do we maximize social impact? Through programs, through projects. And those programs, projects have a certain outcome or goal. And that, of course, is nothing but the goal of the organization. Because if we have delivered on the goals in the program, we have delivered on our goals in the as an organization. So the operational risk is not being able to meet the organizational goals. The third is financial risk, anything which is wrong done, which is done. So we have to understand what are the areas in an organization where there are risks. That is what we are trying to understand. And after that, you will find that there are so many areas in our organization where there are risks. But can we address all of them at one go? Not necessary. You might have to identify, and that's what is called the risk management process. We will see that. Now, improper financial planning, improper management is what is financial. It will cause harm. What will these risks do? They will likely occur, and second, they will cause harm to our organization. It may actually cause the death of the organization or the existence of the organization. Reputational risk basically is damage to image, which we have already seen. Now, safety risk is basically accidents, illness. Security risk is any kind of violence or crime. Okay. Safety is more in terms of individual, security is more in terms of the organization. So, do we have a security risk plan? Is something that you'll have to. Do we have health, safety, and environment being taken care of? Please remember, we had talked about all this in the HR policy kind of areas. Then, fiduciary risk. Fiduciary means anything to prevent this risk means any loss, financial loss to the organization. Okay. What it means is that, there is some kind of a threat because we have not followed our roles and responsibilities as a in terms of fiduciary responsibility. Now the fiduciary responsibility is mainly the management responsibility and governance responsibility. So if there is a breach of trust there, then there will be a loss because of this. Very important to understand fiduciary risk. Top management has fiduciary risk. The governing body has fiduciary risk because they are the ones who have to ensure that the organization does not you know face trouble because of risks. The next one is legal compliance, which I have already said. If you do not comply, action can be taken by the authorities. Even your registrations can be withdrawn and you will no longer be a charitable institution. So that's a risk. Okay. Technology is a risk. Information risk means basically your digital assets, your systems, your information is there, because we have seen in the first session, technology is making a big change for not for profits, and therefore the information risk is becoming an increasing important risk. Then you have competition risk. Okay, nobody used to talk of competition risk, but now there are so many not for profits which are competing for the same particular project. So that is also becoming a competition, is becoming a risk. And in terms of better internal controls, better risk management, I think you have a better chance of getting the project versus the others who may not have the right kind of risk management systems and internal controls. So it's not just how programmatically you are doing, but how institutionally also you are doing, which is important for the donors to assess in terms of this competition risk. So I have put down some of the risks that an organization has to face. Okay. Now, again, I want to say, from tomorrow onwards, will you be able to address all these risks? No, probably you will have to identify the risks which are likely to occur more, and which are the ones which are likely to cause more harm. Next. So we are continuing with the key concepts, and we have talked about risk as such. Risk is one, potential, second, one, probability, and second, potential impact. Now, risk management. So if you have risk, then you have to have risk management, risk mitigation, risk reduction. All these are similar words. Now, do organizations have a provision for risk management or a system of risk management? And what is the system of risk management? Practices, procedures, protocols, as we call them, PNPs, that reduce the probability of the risk and the potential impact of the risk. Okay, so both. What is risk management? After understanding the risk, do we have policies, procedures, and protocols which will reduce the likelihood of that risk occurring, and even if it and also the impact, the adverse impact of that risk? That is what is called risk management. Okay, and so you may have risk management in one area, but if you implement risk management throughout the organization, that's what is called as enterprise or integrated risk management, or ERM. Okay, enterprise risk management, which actually is covering the entire, all the areas: operational, informational, fiduciary, security, all of them. If we cover, then that means that our risk management is enterprise wide. Okay, throughout the enterprise it is there. I said risk management, we have already said this. Risk mitigation is risk reduction. Risk management cannot make the risk zero. It can only reduce the risk. Okay. So let's understand this very clearly, that risk management is risk reduction. It is not eliminating risk. And we now move on to the concept of risk management policy. So after understanding the cons, the why of the reason for risk management, okay, our risk appetite, risk tolerance concept, and the bridging the gap between risk appetite and risk tolerance, bringing in the risk management process. Then we had seen from that rationale of risk management, we had seen why risk management in not for profits. Okay, so to ensure stability, sustainability, operational efficiency, compliance, and all that. And then we had moved on to the concept of understanding the concepts of risk and threat. Threat is more universal, and from that, whenever you take action, we from those threats become risk, and those risks have two characteristics, two features. One, the probability, and the second is the impact or the potential impact. So we have then said that if we are able to if we have understood the risk, then we will go to the next step, which is risk management system. Okay. And risk management system will mean that for those risks, you have internal policies and procedures so that you can better understand those risks and address those risks. And when we extend risk management processes throughout the organization, it becomes ERM, or enterprise risk management. Okay. We have come until now. Now, that's the theoretical construct for risk management that we have understood. But now, how do we bring risk management as a matter of policy in our organization is what we are going to study. Okay, and then you will be able to understand why risk management policy should be there. Now, as I said, donor audits and due diligence by prospective donors, they are insisting on a risk management policy. Uh, Second reason for risk management policy is to bring an understanding, okay, uh, on about risk and how to address risk as an organization grows. So as the organization is small, the amount of risk that it has to encounter are less, but as the organization grows, the risk uh, uh, that the organization has to face, they grow. So understanding risk and addressing risk is something that actually the policy brings about. Now, it creates an awareness about risk mitigation strategies, because the process will mean that we have identified risk and now we have to address. So you will know what are the strategies for addressing those risks. Staff, the employees will embrace and own risk, the management process, because who does the risk management? We do the risk management as employees. I mean, nobody else from outside will come. But after understanding the risk, then putting in place risk management strategies, and then being owners of the risk management strategies, implementing those strategies so that we are able to manage the risk. That is it is so simple. It's a governance tools, because at the end of the year, whatever risk we have managed, the identified risk that we have managed, we will put it up to the governing structure or the board or the governing body and say these are the risks that we had identified for this year. And this is the action that we took, and that has brought about a reduction in our risk, so that the harm due to those risks being, having to address those risks because of our operation, we were able to, not have loss because of these risks, because of the risk mitigation. So these are some of the reasons why a risk management policy not only is something dictated by the donors or donor audits, but also within the organization, and understanding of risk, implementing risk strategies, and then also reporting to the board. Now, what is the risk management process? So you will have a policy, okay? Uh, you will have a policy, and that policy will have the risk management process. As you said, as we have seen, we have the finance policy, and within finance policy, you may have a procurement policy, and the procurement policy will have procedures. As we have seen various procedures. When will we do limited tendering? What will be the procedure for limited tendering? So also you have a risk management policy where you have said we will need a policy to address risk. But how do you do that risk management is what we are now understanding as the risk management process. This is the most important part of the risk management system. One is that, as I had said, the entire universe of risk is something that the organization is, facing. Point number two is identifying from that universe the risks that will affect our organization. So not all risks that are there or threat in the environment that is there, that universe will have a lot of risks, a lot of threats, but they will not all be relevant to us. So from that universe, we will have to identify some risks. Say, for instance, from the compliance. So in the environment, there is compliance risk. Okay, not registering, not reporting on time. And identified that because we are still not, fully understanding it, we have identified compliance risk as one such risk. Okay, you may identify more such risks. Okay, you might identify, besides compliance risk, information risk. You might have financial risk. So suppose you have two or three areas of risk that you have identified from the universe of the risk, because you cannot address all the risks. So some risks have been identified, and now we will assess those risks. Okay, and that risk assessment, that is the third stage in the risk management process. That is risk assessment. Now we will have to say the identified risks that we had from the laundry list. So we had the laundry list, and from the laundry list, we shortlisted and identified some risks. Okay, five risks, four risks, six risks that we think will affect and are likely to affect, and they are likely to cause harm. So they now you need to assess whether the identified risk, all of them need similar attention, or from the identified risk, we will only be able to look at some of the risk given our organization. Okay, so that is what is called the risk assessment process, the stage of risk assessment. Okay, now this matrix I have put, okay, is the one that brings, that puts the risk on a kind of a, on a graph. So on the left hand side is probability. Okay, that identified risk, how much is the probability? Now this is a subjective exercise. Okay, this cannot be objective, but management and other people in the team who understand the identified risk will then try to say what is the probability. Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Okay, and similarly on the right hand side, so on the x axis, which is on the y axis, you have probability. On the x axis, which is uh, the what I have mentioned as consequences. Okay, uh, consequences means impact. Okay, and probability is likelihood. Probability is probability, likelihood, and consequences is potential impact. So on the x-axis you have impact, and the y-axis you have likelihood. And on both these parameters, because they are the two features of this, we are trying to now say, is it insignificant? Is it moderate? Is it minor? Is it major? Is it catastrophic? Catastrophic means, it can create the very existence of your organization might have problem. In probability, remote up to almost certain. Now, what I have done is I have tried to then say which are the risks which are high. So suppose there were these risks, the green, yellow, and red, all of them are the risks that we have actually to plot on this graph on parameters of probability and consequences. And when we have done the 1 to 5 for both, some of the risks on the top extreme right will be the risk which will be very high on certainty and high in terms of impact. Now, these are the risks, as I have on the right hand side also said, okay, 0 to 8, 9 to 14, and 15 to 25. Now, what is this 15 to 25? This is basically nothing but the multiplication of probability into consequences. Okay, P into C gives you a certain sum, which is what is the 15 to 20. So what our understanding is, given your plotting of the identified risk on the risk assessment matrix, will give you what are the risks which have to be prioritized. Now you had identified, you have now assessed those risks, but all of those identified risks also we may not want to, address, because some of the risks, like the one which are in the green, may be risks that we have identified but are not going to cause harm. So in that case, why should we devote so much time and resources to them? I mean, time basically is resource. So effort that we may have to make to address those which are in the green might not be required. And it might be better to look at the ones which are in the red, more importantly, or some of the orange ones. So whatever is the likelihood multiplied by impact, or L into I as I call it, if it is between 15 to 25, those are the risks which are high risk for the organization in terms of likelihood of occurring and potential impact. Now, once we have done this, the risk assessment is when we will go to the next stage in the management process, which is prioritize risks. Now, these are, so I think from the previous matrix, I think we have six risks: one, two, three, four, five, six. Six risks in the red are the risks out of this entire uh, uh, matrix, which we will consider as our prioritized risk during this year or during this period, because they are the ones which probably need to be addressed. Now, after we have actually prioritized this risk, we will now have to set up a risk response system, or this is the step. So these are all steps that are being followed. Okay. First was universe of risk. Second is risk identification. Third is risk assessment. Fourth is risk prioritization. And next, right now, what we are doing is risk response. We have to work on these risks so that the likelihood and impact can be reduced or managed. Used to zero, but it should be managed. Now, what is done as far as risk response is concerned is preparation of risk registers. Now, risk register is nothing but plotting the risks that are prioritized on the in the form of an Excel, and then saying what will be our action that we will take, who will take the action, what will be the role and responsibility of those people who will take action, what is the timeline within which action will be taken, and at the end of the period of risk response, what is it that we will achieve in terms of reduction of that risk? That is what is called a risk register. So a risk register may be different for different kind of organizations, but what it actually does is the prioritized risks are put on the register. So you have a normal register, and on that register you will say these are one, two, three my prioritized risks. These prioritized risks will be the response for reduction of that. These will be the action. Third, who will take on the responsibility for that action? That is the roles and responsibility of staff. Do we need some additional resources for that? That will have to be identified. In most cases, you may not need additional resources. You might need to have protocols in place, you might need to have policies in place, but that does not require too much of resources. Sometimes internally you can draw those policies and procedures. That's common sense. Okay. And you know your organization better than a consultant. Once you have taken a decision about actions, roles and responsibility, and resources, then you will start working on those risks in terms of reduction. And at the end of the period, on the same register is what you are going to actually say, this is the action that we did, and that is the risk reduction that happened. Okay. So the monitoring will happen during the period that you have decided for yourself to reduce the risk, and after the monitoring period is over, then you will have to report how you fared on that prioritized risk individually, one by one. So risk number one, we decided to take these actions. These were the responsibility of these people. This was the resource allocation. This is the period in which we wanted to reduce it. We monitored it, and the one, two, three, four, that was the way we monitored it. And at the end of the period, you will have to report it on the risk register on the right hand side, saying that is what we did in terms of risk reduction. And this reporting will go to the board and to the CEO, basically the CEO and the board, saying that the risk management process resulted in lessening the risk occurrence and lessening the impact of the risk. Now, so we come to the end of the risk management policy, and I go to now to the next topic, which is internal controls. Okay. Now, so the risk management policy, as you have seen, is nothing but a dynamic policy. Every year, or every period that you might decide for yourself, you will have to repeat this risk management process, and you will then come up with newer risks, because some of the risks you have already identified. Suppose there was a risk for which the only action to be taken was policies and procedure. Okay. That policy and procedure document has been made, and that has been during the process of monitoring. During the process of monitoring, that particular monitoring, as you can see, the process of in the purple, the monitoring process was there of that policy, because that policy, we said we will make this policy, and this policy on cash and bank, or on investment, or whatever, or on some area of HR, on performance appraisal, and that we will do in terms of monitoring. Implementing actually is monitoring, seeing that it is actually being implemented, and if any correction has to be made, that correction is made. And at the end of the period, you will have that risk covered. You know, people not being properly evaluated for in terms of their performance, and you will have a performance appraisal policy, and then you will report that now we have a performance appraisal policy, which from the next cycle will ensure that any uncertainty or a risk because of you know uh, incompetent people getting performance appraisals and promotions is reduced. That is a risk. It depends on what you have identified as a risk. I'm just giving an example. So uh, next year you will then come up with the same exercise of the risk universe, then identifying risks in your understanding that you consider are important, then assessing those risks on the risk assessment matrix, and the risks that have a coefficient of between 15 to 25, you might identify them as the risks that need to be addressed. Even from those risks that you have identified that have coefficient of 15 to 25, you may actually look at some of those risks which are your risk priority for this period. And those risk priorities will have a risk response process, which is the risk register. And once the the risk response process has been initiated, you will monitor it to ensure that we are able to control the risk and then report it to management in terms of saying, well, it efficiently resulted in this. Or you might have a situation where you might want to say, well, we might have to continue this for some more period of time before we can say that the risk has been addressed. So it will depend on this situations to this situation. But once you have completed this cycle, then again you will repeat the same cycle next year in terms of identifying newer risks, prioritizing, assessing those risks, prioritizing those risks, okay, creating a response mechanism for risk, and then reporting. And that cycle continues year from year. This is the risk management process within your risk management policy. So sometimes I find that risk management policy has been prepared and they are talking of the risk management process, but the risk management process has never been followed in the organization. Now, that is immaterial. That means that you have not even understood the concept of risk, let alone putting in place a risk management system. Okay, so it's not, it's a policy which is a speaking document, live document, which has to be practiced. Now I come to the other side. Just as I said, you have fever. Fever is the risk. Just as you have risk in organization and the various types of risks that we had seen. Now, when you have fever, then the way that you want to address that fever, which is causing a risk to your uh, body, is something which similarly an antibiotic is something like an antibiotic that we need to look at for the organization which is facing so many of those risks. We saw various risks, fiduciary, this, that, security, safety, reputation. Now, how do we control those risks is through mechanism of internal control. Okay. Now, internal control is the antibiotic for risk as far as an organization is concerned. Now, these are practices that serves as checks and balances. Checks and balances means that they will ensure that the risk is checked. And checks and balances also means that there is a mechanism of validation at every stage on internal and external stakeholders. So basically, these are practices. Practice means you have to follow, not put it on paper. Now, internal controls are practices, mechanisms, procedures that mitigate the risk, okay, to reduce the risk, okay. Why, if the risk is reduced, then you will bring the loss to acceptable level, because we said that loss risk will not reduce the loss to zero. So the loss cannot be zero always, but the loss will be reduced to acceptable level, something that you can tolerate, something that you can tolerate, okay. So that is something that internal controls do. Now, therefore, I said risks and control are two sides of the same coin. If risks are there, controls have to be there. Otherwise, risk will wipe out your organization or will can cause, catastrophic loss to your organization or huge danger to your organization. So that's something that needs to be understood. And we will see what internal controls are. So while we have seen risk, what are the internal controls? And it's always good to know what those areas of internal control is. So internal controls are basically three types. One is what is called preventive control. So you have preventive control is through the risk register. So you have identified a risk. Now your response is in terms of having controls. So you have put controls in place after identifying that risk so that you can prevent loss. That is what is called preventive control. Now, always preventive control will be possible. The answer is no. Sometimes during the because you have not been you cannot address all the risks, but all those risks that you can address through controls which are preventive controls will ensure that the risk is actually addressed. So you may have preventive controls in terms of policies and procedures on HR, finance, risk management, conflict of interest, all those, posh. So those are preventive controls. But having put in those policies, have you been able to address all the issues, all the risks? The idea is no. Even the policies might not be able to capture all those risks. Because as I said last time, the policies are dynamic documents. They keep changing because the risks keep occurring, the risk profiling keeps on changing, and therefore you need to make changes in your policy. Now, detective control means that at some stage in the operation of your organization, some controls that either were in place or were not in place are identified. That is what is detection, or not identified or detected. Now, that is what is called as detective control. So you detect errors or problems. Okay, so you have audit, and we'll see audit in the last session. Reconciliations we have already seen when we talked about accounting. Physical inventorying, you check and you find that there is a control lapse there. Because can we have control, or can we identify risk and have controls for every area? Ideas answer is no. Slowly we might be able to, cover more and more risks and risk areas through internal controls as we grow. But we cannot address all risks through internal controls at one go. It's not possible because the organization also has to run. But if there is a case where you have detected uh, a certain risk, or a risk or a control lapse, then you can go in for corrective control. So based on the detective control or the detection of that control lapse, you can introduce control by way of a new policy, by way of a new procedure, whatever it is. And that's what is called as corrective control. Now, the corrective control, once it is put, will take you to point number A, which is preventive control. Now, that particular control lapse or risk is now taken care of, because for that risk there is a preventive control in place, and that cycle keeps repeating. So you may have detective controls, audit next time will come and point out to something, and you might have a mechanism where you change your procedures, you change your policies, and bring about corrective control, and that corrective control will become the preventive control, because then next time the auditor will not point out to the same mistake, because that has already been taken care of. That is what are the three types of controls when I say preventive, detective, and corrective controls. Now, this is a kind of a cycle essentially, but these are all very relevant. Preventive is that that the risk did not even affect you, or the risk had been identified and addressed at the beginning, for which we introduced preventive controls. Okay, so that's how it is. Now, what are the benefits of internal controls? Basically, it's an early warning sign system. Basically, it says that if you do not have those controls, then you are exposed to risk. So that's a warning, that's an alert. It prevents fraud. It avoids external audit findings, because if you have internal controls, detective control or detection of errors will not be so many. Avoid statutory and regulatory penalties is what internal control. So if you have a policy and procedure on compliance management or compliance control, as we call it, then everybody in the organization will know that these actions have to be taken in order to ensure regulatory and statutory compliances. So that is the benefit that you everybody understands that, and on regulation you are not faltering. But you can have collision, which means you can millibhagat, you can together unethically do something. Human error might be there and unforeseen circumstances which may not have actually been taken care of in the internal controls are limitations. Now, what are the key areas of internal controls in NGOs? Okay, is something that I will cover now. So, uh, now what I am saying is that uh, internal controls can be bucketed into three broad types. Okay. So when we talk of controls or internal controls is internal management of risk, nothing else. Internal management of risk is internal controls. And internal management of risk, how will it happen? When you have systems, policies, procedures, and protocols. Now, mostly all internal controls can be, put into three categories or buckets. One is what is called financial control. Second is operational control, and third is compliance control. Financial controls, everything to do with finances of the organization. Operational control, everything to do with day-to-day working and more in terms of, the programmatic part. And the compliance control is basically in terms of compliance with rules and regulations and also in terms of governance. Okay. So compliance and governance controls is essentially in terms of saying whether the governance structure is being properly implemented in this organization or not. Now, if you were to look at internal controls, all of those internal controls that I have put down below, okay. So I've put in about 10, 12 of them. Whether they are all capturing the complete story, idea answer is no. But I have tried to give illustratively as examples of what are the various areas of internal controls. Okay. What are the various areas in which internal controls have to be put in place? And those areas in which internal controls have to be placed will be the outcome of your risk assessment process. Do you think legal compliance is a risk that needs to be addressed? Do you think governance is a risk? Do you think budgeting is a risk? Do you think income is a risk? Do you think donor management is something that we are not able to do and therefore we are not getting money? Is HR a risk? So while these areas, they can all be put either as financial, operational, or compliance. All all of them. So I've actually tried to then detail from the three buckets areas that you might want to understand. And whether you will be able to address all of them in one go, answer is no. But you will be in a better position to say which areas I will have uh, risk management, which areas will I have risk management at different periods of time is going to be the outcome of the risk management process. Where after risk identification, we did risk assessment and then prioritize the risk. So the various risks will be there and the controls will be the ones that I have mentioned here. So if compliance risk is a risk in terms of not reporting, not registering, then compliance controls will be the first, legal compliance will be the first area of control or first control in your risk register. So you will say, well, compliance is a risk. Now, what needs to be done? All necessary registrations to be obtained within the next 1 year. That's the point. The third thing is who will be responsible for getting that? I think the head of finance and the chief functionary will be responsible. How do we do it? Do we have the internal capability to do it, or do we depend on consultant? What is the resource outflow? Within how much period of time it will be done? And then you will keep monitoring. So you have made an application. Now you have to see whether the registration has come or not. You have done the regular periodic reporting. You will have to see whether any action is taken in terms of any non-compliance or anything, any error that is there. So once you have during that monitoring scene, you will have to come to the reporting stage where you'll say, well, I have addressed the legal and compliance risk through the risk register as a risk response. That's how it is. I think you are understanding what I'm trying to say. Okay, so this entire presentation is, kind of connected that way. Now I come to some of the areas of internal controls that we are looking at. Okay, we are looking at internal control areas. So if we are looking at internal control around legal compliance, which in the three areas are we talking about? We are talking about compliance controls. So what are the statutory and regulatory, compliance? uh, there is a difference between statutory and regulatory. Okay. Statutory means that you have to abide by that law or that legislation or that statute. And what does that statute say? It says you will have to get yourself registered, or you will have to comply, or you will have to follow. But the regulatory part is essentially the rules which then say how is the reporting going to happen, or how the registration will happen. That's the regulatory part. So statutory may be one time, and regulatory will continue to occur, periodically, one after the other. That's how the difference. Although we talk statutory and regulatory as the same fashion, but there is a difference between these two words. Okay, just as there is a difference between grant and donation. So all applicable statutory registrations is something that is the statutory part. Okay. Uh, So what is the compliance control in terms of legal compliances? Do we have all the statutory registrations that are required for our organization to run? Okay. And are they valid? Or have they not expired? Have their period of registration not expired, or not? Is it valid or is it not valid? And have we applied at the right time in terms of extension of the validity, or re-registration, or renewal, for instance, whatever. So the registrations are our 12 AB registration, which you all know now. Our basis of charitable uh, the basis of our being a charitable institution is our 12 AB registration. Okay. ATG is an approval that gives benefit to the donor. Our tax uh, account number, collection and deposit, our PAN, our FCRA registration, our NGO Darpan UIN, the unique identification number, our MCA CSR1, our EPF registration, if we are registered, either our ESI registration, our professional tax registration, our Shops and Establishment Act registration. Now, most of these that you are seeing here require registration. However, there are some statutes where there is no registration. For instance, gratuity. Gratuity, there is no registration required, but you have to comply with the Gratuity Act. As we had seen, once your number of people go beyond 10, and you will have to make provision for gratuity, or you will have to fund it or invest it through a group gratuity plan. Now, in that case, there is no registration that is required. However, there is this statutory compliance. So I have tried to put together what are the registrations and regulate and statutory compliances that are required as far as legal compliances are concerned. These are all required, because if you don't comply with this, there is a compliance risk. And compliance risk, it is there, means that your registration or your existence may be questioned. Then the donor will not be comfortable in giving you money. So therefore, legal compliance has today become one of the major risks as far as not-for-profits is concerned. It was not a risk early. So at 12 AB, we used to get perpetual registration, and no periodic renewal. Now, if you have a 12 AB as a charitable institution, you have a 5-year registration. Okay, and that has to be renewed, which means that it is not just the regulatory part or the statutory part of having the registration, it's the regulatory part. The regulatory part means compliances with rules. Are we filing things on time? Is our assessment happening on time? Is the assessment happening in line with what the rules are saying or not? That is also an equally important, because if it is not happening like that, our registration might actually not be renewed. So that is the annual regulatory filing, the difference between statutory and regulatory. Okay, so the periodic regulatory filing will be your ITR, will be your TDS returns, will be your EPF returns, return, will be your ESI returns, half yearly professional tax depositing, the, the compliance with the constitution authority, that is your registrar of society, your ROC. So these are what, because you are registered now, you have to report to them. That is what is called the regulatory reports or filings that need to be done. So registration might be for a period of time, but 5 years. But within those 5 years, there are so many regulatory reportings that need to be done. That also needs to be done, because otherwise your statutory registration might actually get questioned. So you have to proactively check on your portals whether any adverse action has been taken. Take action as and when there is an intimation to you. You have to be aware of what are the changes that are happening. So many changes are happening every day now as far as regulations are concerned for not for profit. So unless we are able to understand that, we will not be able to adjust to the situation, and that might become a risk for us. So the capacity building of organizations on through continued education on legal compliances is becoming a very major. That, so how do we address legal compliance risk? Through internal controls by way of, having a calendar, a compliance calendar, and seeing whether we are complying with all of them, ticking the calendar, checking our portals, getting our staff educated and aware about the changes that are there, understanding the implication of those changes. Those are the controls that have to be there for, you know addressing the legal compliance risk. So the legal compliance is throwing up a risk, and what are the controls? Timely registration, timely reporting, accurate reporting, checking your portals, whether it's the FC portal, whether it's the Traces portal, it's the income tax portal, whatever portal, to see that there are no actions against us, no adverse proceedings against us, getting educated in terms of what are the changes in legal compliances that are happening from time to time, and adjusting our actions to the changes, because some of the changes that are changing, that are happening in terms of reporting and regulatory changes, might also require us to change the way that we work, or the way that we create our documents, the way that we create our reporting. That has also to be understood. Next is internal controls around governance. This is very, very important. We do not give much attention to this. So governance means so there's a difference between management and governance. Management is day-to-day execution. Governance has a different role. It not only just needs to check management, but it has a fiduciary role. That is, the assets, the resources uh, are being managed uh, in the way that they should be managed of that organization. Okay. Uh, so what is a fiduciary responsibility for someone? For someone, you are managing their assets or their resources. Suppose somebody were to come and tell you, for this particular person, you have a fiduciary responsibility, which means that I am now giving all the resources that I have for the welfare of this person to you, and you have a position of trust. So also the governance structure has a fiduciary or a trust responsibility to the organization. And at the top, they have to ensure that the assets and the resources are being utilized for the best objective or the goals of that organization. That's what is the role of government. So, and we do not again give due importance to governance and governance procedures. So what is the governance structure as per bylaws or your rules and regulations or your articles of association? Sometimes we don't even read because those are so old. So what is the structure? What are the rules and responsibility of each of those people? What about meetings of those governance structure? as per the bylaws, how will the proceedings of those minutes of those meetings be documented by way of minutes? Okay, are they being done in the right fashion? I do a lot of due diligence for organizations, and I find that their governance structure is not in proper order. It's not in line with their bylaws. Their meetings are not held in time. The roles and responsibility of people who are in governance is not known. The meetings are held, but there is no understanding of what this meeting needs to discuss. Is this a meeting for which is the responsibility of the governance structure, or is the responsibility of management? So the performance of organize, and as long as your governance controls are not in proper order, they are not strict, your organization will not move upwards. If you see medium, middle, medium and bigger organization, they are trying to get the best of brains in this sector to be part of their governance structure. Why? Because they know that this governance structure will bring best practices in the sector, having been part of governance structure elsewhere, and we need that. Sometimes we take this very leniently, or as management we don't want to educate the governance structure, so we will always continue to be small organization because we have no governance control. And that's a very negative point as far as donors are concerned during due diligence, and when they want to give you money. So meetings, proceedings, recording, all those, for that you'll have to have procedure for that. Now that procedure is basically the bylaws. But are we following the bylaws? So the bylaws or the rules are the internal controls for governance. Okay. But the important thing is, are the bylaws being followed? Changes in the governing structure, is it notified and approved? Okay. By the statutory bodies. So if there is a change in the management, in the board, then you have to, you know that in FCRI, I told you that you have to intimate it to the MHA. Similarly, if there is a change in the governance structure, you will also have to intimate it to the income tax department and various other places, to banks, for instance, for change in signatory. So all that has to be ensured. Somebody should be taking up that responsibility. So the board is responsible for the various policies. Okay, all statutory business. So the governance structure, both in terms of the governing body and the general body. So is the general body meeting for the statutory business, that is approval of the statutory audit, approval of the statutory auditor, approval of the budget, approval of the work plan? Is it being done or not? So I find most of the time the general body meets, and whatever is the general body, once in a year it meets the annual general body. The annual general body, whatever it is, roles and responsibilities in the bylaws are not actually being done in terms of the meeting and the proceedings of the meeting. So what I'm trying to say is that the governance in terms of structure, but also following the governance procedures, is what is the internal control. And a lot of the governance procedures are mentioned in the bylaws or the rules. If they are not, you can amend the bylaws or rules and include them, because again, the bylaws which were made 20 years back may not be relevant. And you will have to ensure that they are relevant. So that's something that I want to say. Legal action, very important. These days, donors are saying, we want to find out, is there any legal action or any violation of any laws by any of the members of the governance structure? Very important. They want an undertaking from us. Uh, if there are people who are related, we had seen section 13 where we had seen people who are either authors or settlers or promoters or their relatives. If they are there, then are we complying with those procedures? Are we not? Are we ensuring that we are not giving undue benefit to those people? All that. Approval of policies and procedures, please remember, is the responsibility of the governance structure, because then the governance structure will see whether those policies and procedures have been followed, because governance approves policy, management implements policy. Okay, and makes a request for revision in policy if certain revisions are required, which again will be approved. Remember, when we had talked about organizational policies, we had said the governance structure is the one which is responsible for policies and procedure approval. Formulation might happen by the governance structure or by management, but approval and revisions have to happen from the governance structure. So what I'm trying to explain is that the governance structure has to be given due importance, and procedures that are already laid out, and if they are not, then those procedures have to be followed. Coming now to budgetary control, and I'm not going to do so much of it. Basically, we have seen that in our section or session on grant management, that budgetary controls need to be put in place. Why do you need budgetary controls? Why do you need internal control on budget? Why? Because there is a risk with not utilizing, overutilizing, or violating any of the conditions relating to the budget that has been given to you by the donor. Now, in all those situations, is it likely that it might happen? Yes, it is likely, because budgets are estimates and actuals are actuals. So it is likely. But by not having controls and overspending, underspending, overspending in certain line items which is not permitted, is that a potential adverse impact that it can cause? Yes, because there can be disallowance of expenditure. And how will we get the money from that has been spent? Because we are not a for-profit entity. So you need controls around budgets, because budget is the one document or one mechanism through which funds are made available to the organization. So, what did we see in our section on budgets and budgetary control? You need to have a mechanism for budget variance or monitoring of budget through budget variance reports. And that is what exactly I've written. And then, if there is a variance, what is it that we do with the variance in time is the budgetary control. So do we go to the donor and say, well, please allow us this, we want to make this change, we want to make this amendment, we want to have a no cost extension because the money is available, but we have not fulfilled the output, but we need 6 months of additional time for the project, but we will not ask you for any additional money. All those are controls around budgetary controls, and this budgetary control will be part of your finance policy, the budget policy in your finance policy, and the budgetary control will be laid out as a procedure in this section on budget in your finance policy. But it's not just for the sake of mentioning it in the finance policy. It is in the sense that you will have to have budget monitoring sessions or budget monitoring meetings. And in the budget monitoring meeting, you will see the budget variance report as a budget monitoring tool and see any changes that need to be done in terms of budgetary control. So that's the difference between budget monitoring and budgetary control also. Now coming to the other areas, internal controls around grants and other income. So we have also done a lot of this. We know that grant funds are restricted funds. So this is some revision also that is happening. Session number 2, we have said grant is an obligation. Okay. So what is the whether the money has been credited to the designated bank account? Why? Because we are following the principle of fund-based accounting. If you still remember that grant has been, safety of the grant, treatment of interest. Okay. What is your periodic grant reconciliation and reporting, segregation of duties? Now, all this will also be part of your finance policy. So this will be part of your financial controls. We had said all controls can be three types: operational, financial, and governance and compliance. So this is again, so a lot of the internal controls, because we deal with finance, will be part of financial controls. All of them, most of them actually. So if you have your finance controls in terms of finance policy, then most of these areas will be captured in the finance policy by way of financial control. Okay. Proper receipts, proper recording, proper reporting. So those are some of the points. Proper issue of receipts, grant receipts. Okay. You remember the form 10BD and the form 10BE, the statement of donation and the donation receipt from the portal. All that is what needs to be put in place in terms of grant. as such internal controls around grant. If you have other incomes by way of interest, how will that money be utilized? When comes to expenditure, so we have program expenditure, and this is something when we were talking about costing. Okay, we had talked about cost and expense, and we had said that cost is generally capital expenditure, which has life of more than 1 year, program expenditure or revenue expenditure, which will get consumed. And then we had said that we use the functional basis of costing. So the functional basis means what does our NGO stand for? Our NGO stands for service delivery. So for delivering the services, what are the two costs that we had seen? Program expenditure and administrative expenditure. Okay. Uh, which is the support expenditure for the program expenditure. So that's how the expenditure is in a not for profit. It will be capital expenditure or revenue expenditure, and that expenditure will be either in the nature of program expenditure for service delivery as per the functional head of expenditure, or it will be a support cost by way of administrative expenditure to support the program. Now, that's our understanding of expenditure. What are the controls around expenditure? Okay. Has the expenditure been done per budget? Okay. Is there any, wrong expenditure being done, which is not permitted by the budget? Are we doing expenditure which is based on our estimation of costs? Okay. All that is part of expenditure because uh, is the are proper receipts or proper bills or invoices being taken for the expenditure? Okay. uh, so is there is the expenditure in line with the project plan? Okay. It should not be, it should be allocable. If you remember the word allocable. Okay. uh, is there no misappropriation of the funds by way of wrong expenditure, excessive expenditure? All that is something that you will have to see by way of internal controls. So you will then put in place internal controls for expenditure in your finance policy. You'll say whenever there is a transaction happening which has monetary implication for a project, these are the various things that we will need to do. One, we will have to say, well, that this expenditure was done considering that budget availability was there. The expenditure was done on a good for which we got three quotations. The three quotation meant that we got the best price for that particular item. That purchase was done, the amount was spent, that amount was as per our budget. All that is something which is the expenditure control. Okay. Did we get the invoice from them? Did somebody sign on that invoice and said, well, it is as per this? Was it recorded in the expenditure book? Is all the aspects or proper filing and documentation of bills, vouchers, okay, is what I've mentioned here, is the invoice expenditure control. Because if we do not have proper invoices, proper bills, if they are not recorded in tally, if they are not summarized properly, then you will not be able to get the financial. So on expenditure, not only just in terms of the incurring the expenditure, but also in terms of documentation and recording, reporting of that expenditure is also part of the internal control on expenditure. So you will find that virtually every area in your organization can have policies, procedures for controlling that particular area. Now, purchase uh, procurement controls. Okay, I'm not reading out what is procurement. We have done the procurement process cycle as a separate section. Now, what are the procurement process? We have already done this. Okay, but so what are the internal controls around procurement? You remember all this? We had done the entire process right from technical specification to budget to procurement committee to obtaining bids to to have a vendor database to obtain bids, to evaluate bids, to issue purchase order or contract. We had seen the difference between a purchase order and a contract. How what is contract management is what we had seen. So we receive the goods, inspect the goods, verify the goods, and make the payment. Okay, that's what is procurement process. So what are the internal controls? which you will find in the procurement policy. Okay. Uh, so how will the procurement process be is what is the internal control. So one step to another, as we had seen in the previous slide. Uh, Vendor database, vendor identification is also part of the procurement policy as a procedure. Appropriate bids. So that is the those are the procurement methods that we have. Okay. Uh, so we had seen, if you remember, uh, open tendering, limited tendering, no tendering, where the value based on how much is the value of the procurement. So the value of the procurement means materiality. If it is material, then more competition we will entertain, we will encourage, so that we get better price, which is what is called as price discovery. Okay, proper assessment, proper evaluation, contracting we had seen. Okay. Contract management, because now it is a legal contract between us and that particular party. We cannot get out of it. We had seen what are the features of a contract. Okay, what are the parts of a contract, and told you about contract management as separate section in procurement. Why? Because the end result of procurement is a contract, and that contract is a binding legal document. So that will also become part of your procurement internal controls. So is there an understanding? What do we need to see before signing off on a contract as program person? Okay. Now, accurate and complete information in the purchase order, procurement of goods, uh, uh, one internal control is procurement tracker. Okay, so procurement tracker means if you have several procurements, can you make a tracker or a sheet on Excel? That's not a problem. In terms of tracking various procurements, is what is called as procurement track. So then these are some of the areas. I'll move on to human resources. Now, human resources management, we have seen the human resources policy. Okay. So what are the various controls in human resource management? Okay. So we have to have proper planning, we have to have proper recruitment, and we had seen in the HR policy there are separate sections. So what is how recruitment will be done is a method of internal control. Will it be from an external agency? What kind of a job description will it ensure? Proper orientation of, orientation is induction. Okay. Nepotism we had already seen. So we have seen so many of these particular areas. Now, why I am mentioning this is, although we have seen them, I'm only trying to say that all these policies are a tool of internal control. That is what we have to understand. Now, coming to fixed assets and inventory, we have seen the difference. What are the areas control over fixed assets and inventories? Uh, so have a policy for assets and inventory. That is what is it is uh, in your finance policy. I will suggest that your finance policy should cover everything. It should not be that you have a separate travel policy, separate fixed asset policy. Your finance policy should cover all areas relating to resource allocation. Okay. And we had seen what resource allocation means. Okay. uh, Now, how do we request? What is the need for assets? How do we purchase those assets? What specification? What do you do for the fixed asset register? So the procurement will be based on the procurement process, but we will have a mention of that as an internal control in the fixed asset section or the inventory section. What is the fixed asset register? Whereas how will it be recorded? How will it be issued? How will it be saved? How will safety of that asset be kept? How will it complete its full life? All those are things. How will loss of asset be treated? Is there a policy? How will asset which has completed its useful life be disposed of? What will be the procedure for that? Those are all internal controls. I cannot just say this computer is not of value, I can just give it to somebody. No, there is an internal control, because that internal control will bring about the trust in the donor that they have a policy where the money that I gave them and they bought an asset is going to be driven by a particular internal control. So internal controls around accounts, I'm not getting into that areas of internal control on accounting. Basically, all accounting areas, segregation of duties, checks and balances, recording, reporting are all controls. This will be part of your finance policy. Cash and bank transaction, dual signatories, reconciliation of banks, bank reconciliation statement as it is called, uh, online net banking being done properly, archiving, audit trail, all that, change of signatories, all those are part of the internal controls on cash and bank. Internal controls around donors, we have already done that. So we can also look at controls around program implementation. What is our, so that's basically operational controls. Okay. So that will be for you people. Okay. What is it that we have as our program, policy, program implementation policy. Now, what program implementation policy means, how will we plan, how will we design, how will we execute, and how will we monitor? That is what we do as programmers. Can we have a program policy, policy? Generally, we don't have. Generally, organizations, but the good organizations have program policy also. Now, that will ensure that you have proper internal controls on program design and implementation. So how do you, once you have got an indication from some donor or you have identified a need, now we have to make a proposal, is how that proposal to be made in terms of a project. So how will we design the project? How will we plan the project? How will we design the project in terms of, how that project will be designed for implementation? How will we physically implement it? How will we monitor the, the outputs, the outcome? Okay, how will we report it? Is all part of the program policy. Now, many organizations do not have it. So you can have appropriate tools for assessment or measurement of, the impact of that. That can also be part of the policy. So sometimes the program policy might have measurement, matrices, measurement, and learning part also as part of it. Sometimes it will be maybe a part of the research policy. So it will all depend. Now, so that is where I complete my session on internal controls. Now, have I covered all the areas of internal control? The answer is no. But what I'm saying is that we have tried to look at some of the key areas where internal controls have to be implemented. Do internal controls in all the areas have to be put in place? The idea, again, the answer is no. It will be based on the outcome of our risk management process. Now we come to the last section, which is basically on uh, efficiency and effectiveness. Okay. So why are we talking of, this word efficiency and effectiveness? Because we need to understand the difference between these two words. Basically, efficiency is, you know, uh, efficiency is maximizing the output from input. From a certain amount of input, you want to maximize the output. Okay. So if you remember the first session we had done, and the primary objective of an organization not for profit and a secondary operation objective, if you can go back to that slide, you will find that the secondary objective of a not for profit organization is efficient, are three actually. One is economy, cost control is economy, but that we are not talking about that. But with whatever resources we got by ensuring cost control, that's the concept of efficiency, and then the concept of effectiveness. Efficiency meaning, how have we converted the input that we procured into outputs? You have the log frame where you have inputs and output. Now, with the same amount of input, could were we able to generate more output? Is the question. Or were we able to generate less output? Or were we able to generate the desired output only? Now, the idea in efficiency is not that the input should generate less output that we understand at the program design stage, but at least more. Why? Because if you have more output, your input procurement has been good, your human resource as a talent has been better, your procurement of program goods have been good, your procurement of capital goods has been of the right thing, you will get more output. Effectiveness, on the other hand, says whether with that output, the outcomes were achieved or not. The goals and outcomes were achieved or not. Now, finally, efficiency is an intermediary stage. Effectiveness is the final stage. But if you are not efficient, it's unlikely that you will be effective. That is the relationship. Okay. So efficiency is the process, while effectiveness is the final result, is what we have to look at. So you get inputs at the efficiency stage, but at the effectiveness stage, it is the end result, whether we were able to maximize social impact. Okay. Uh, Now, concept of efficiency, we are continuing. Effectiveness assesses whether an NGO is achieving its stated goals and objectives. Now, the idea in effectiveness is to be able to give more outcome or goals with the same amount of resources, because we were economical and efficient. Okay. Now, basically, effectiveness sees outcomes and impact. Oh, effectiveness sees outcomes and impact. Efficiency sees input and output. And so you have input, output, outcome, and impact, which is the four stages in the log frame of any program. I am not a program person, but I'm only telling you. So the efficiency part is the input output. The effectiveness part is the outcome impact. Okay. And the outcome impact will decide whether you will get a re-grant or not. Okay. Uh, Now I am kind of making a comparison between economy and efficiency. Left is efficiency and right is effectiveness. What is the definition? Efficiency refers to performing activities with minimum wastage, time and opportunity, and opportune use of resources timely and without error. So basically, delivering more output. Effectiveness is the extent to which something has achieved the objective or not. Okay. With the output, were we able to achieve the result impact? So when I say effective efficiency, it is doing the task in a correct way in terms of process, and effectiveness is doing the task effectively or accurately. So in terms of the outcome, or in terms of the impact. Efficiency focuses on input and outputs. I had already said effectiveness focuses on outcome and impact. End result of a project. Okay, the focus is different. The next one is in terms of effort. Efficiency focuses on operations. Effectiveness actually focuses on strategy, the program strategy, whether we are able to achieve the program strategy or not. Time orientation, efficiency is time oriented. Effectiveness is not specifically time oriented, it is outcome oriented. So with that, I come to the end of our session. We are slightly ahead of time, basically about 10 odd minutes. So during this 10 minutes, if there are questions, we can take the questions. I'm stopping the presentation. Uh, so before we take any chat or chat questions, or we take on the questions otherwise, if there are, I want to just quickly do a summary of the key takeaway from today's session. The key takeaway from today's session is that we have to protect our organization from loss. Okay, from loss. Just as we protect ourselves from loss. Do you put your money in speculative activities, or do you put your money in you know more safer investment? You put your money in safer investment. You will not speculate, you will not gamble. Okay. If you are gambling, then you're not the right person. So what I'm actually saying is, if you are a person with mind, you will, between two options, just like an option I'm giving, is you will like to put your money in safe investment and not into riskier investment. Why? Because you do not want to incur loss. Now, that is the first basis on which the organization also has to be looked at. So you have to look at the organization as not causing loss to the organization. Now, what causes loss? The biggest cause of loss is risk. And risk is there everywhere. Wherever you take an action, whether personal or organizational, there is risk. Now we understand that risk causes loss. And we said in the first beginning, we don't want loss. Okay. At least we don't want loss. If we don't get enough profit, doesn't matter, but we don't want loss. What loss can be caused because of risk. And we saw the concept of risk appetite and tolerance. And to ensure that you do not cross the boundary of risk tolerance, we have risk management process. And so we said for the risk, for identifying, prioritizing the risk, we will have a risk response. That is our risk management. That is after our understanding of various types of risks that organizations face, and we will decide on some risks that we will address. Now, how do you address the risk? By having suitable policies and procedures or protocols, which is nothing but checks and balances, or what we call as IC, or internal controls. And then we saw the various areas of internal controls that can be, that organizations can look at and have controls in those areas. You can decide some of them, all of them, as you grow and become big, maybe all of them. And what does internal controls do? It mitigates or reduces risk, makes us efficient and effective. The last 3 4 5 slides, what does internal control does? It makes us efficient, and because we are efficient, we are also effective. And if we are effective, we will be competitive. So when we face competitive risk from organizations, other organizations, then because we have been more effective, we will not have that competition risk. So that is the relationship of all these words that I have for you. Now I'm going to the chat if there are questions there. Uh, I don't see a question at all today. If there are any questions that you have, you can unmute and ask questions. I understand that there will not be many questions for this session. I understand that primarily because this session is in terms of internalizing, in uh, bringing the concept into your heart, into your action, into your thought process. And that is what I'm trying to do by giving you this session in the simplest of fashion. Now, you will also realize that risk management is, while we had said risk management is a finance function, but after seeing all this, not all risk management is finance. Since you are an equal partner with finance, you also should know the risk that an organization faces. And risk management policy, implementation of the risk management process is becoming increasingly important. Okay, so with that, if there are any questions we can take, otherwise we can close. Are there any questions that we have? All right, so there are no questions. I will share the recording with in the Impact Yog, and you will get this presentation. And we have on 26th our last session, which is again moving from risk and control. That is why I've kept this session now here. And then we will say we have internal controls. Now, somebody from outside will come to validate whether our internal controls are working or not. So we have seen all aspects relating to finance where we are operating, all procurement, all statements, all, compliance related, mota mata, everything that we need to understand why we are so different, what is our compliance requirement, all that we have seen. Now, we have also then come to the point that we need to have framework in terms of internal control. But whether that framework is helping our organization to manage the risk is not something that we alone will decide. Somebody else will come and say yes or no. Generally, not for programs, but for our, various fiduciary financial requirements, somebody from outside is given the responsibility. And that is what we are going to see in our last session. With that, you will complete your understanding of finance in not-for-profit organizations. Have a great weekend. Thank you very much. And I'll see you on 26th for our last session, not our last interaction, but stay connected, stay in touch, stay educated, stay connected with finance. You will become a better general manager. Thank you very much.